Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. If I could ask you to take your seats. People sitting in back, please feel free to, that last table marked reserve really is not, so please feel free to move up. It's my pleasure as president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics to welcome you and all our friends watching online for an important presentation on tax reforms in India, a vision for the future, by the Finance Minister, Arun Jaitley. We will shortly introduce the minister, but just to say that we are delighted to have him. We had his, I think, probably most useful and most noisy employee, Arvind Subramanian, our dear colleague, here for a speech last month, working with the U.S.-India Business Council. And that was on the new budget, but now to ascend into a different level of the longer-term reform vision coming directly from the finance minister is a great opportunity for all of us, and I'm grateful to the minister for joining us. We're also grateful to have so many friends here from the U.S.-India Business Council, and in that regard, I'd like to call on my colleague Mukesh Aghi, who's president of USIBC, to give a few remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Honorable ministers, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of USIBC and Peterson Institute, I'd like to welcome you, especially the Honorable Minister, to this event. We did have Arvind give us a state of the budget speech, which was extremely positive. And I think today we are anxious to hear from Minister about going forward, and especially on the tax arena and the budget proposal which have been put together. But I just would like to, on behalf of the U.S. business community, would like to compliment the Indian government in regards to, in the last 12 months, they've been able to bring down the inflation, been able to balance the budget quite assertively, and Moody's ratings moving from stable to positive is a very, very positive sign on the budget put together by the minister and his team itself. I think the U.S. business community is keen to partner with India in a lot of areas, and we are moving quite aggressively in that arena. But I think the focus we have also embarked on with the U.S. Business community is trying to see how we can support your initiatives on smart cities, Make in India, Jan Dhan Yojana, and Clean India and Digital India, and beyond that itself. The team at USIBC is focused on trying to see how we can drive the vision of both India and the US of having a trade of almost $500 billion in the next 5 years itself. And that's where the focus is, and we're trying to drive this from a vertical basis itself. I think, let me just take a couple of minutes to introduce the speaker. I think a lot of you know him, but being the finance minister earlier, he was also leading the portfolio on the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and then earlier on law and justice itself. And I would say that he is an advocate in the Supreme Court, and he also was the additional Solicitor General of India itself. But I have to say he is one of the best orator I've come across, and especially, Mr. Minister, your speech as the opposition leader, you have really led the NDA government from that perspective. So on behalf of the attendees here, the U.S. business community, Peterson Institute, and USIBC, I'd like to welcome you, and over to you, Mr. Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just while the minister ascends the stage, just 2 points. First, he's very generously, in recognition of the substance he has to present and the quality of our audience, he's agreed to do this rather informally, seated, and we're hoping to create a tone of interaction, and we will continue with that in a moment. But secondly, just picking up on what our dear friend from the USIBC said, we have been doing a lot of work here at the Peterson Institute about expanding the U.S.-India economic relationship. Arvind Subramanian, of course, was leading that for us. before he went off to actually make policy, for which we're so proud of him. But my predecessor and distinguished colleague, Fred Bergston, had been working with Arvind on that, and will be coming out in the next couple months with a major paper based on that work about the vision we have for U.S.-India economic interchange and development, and we're grateful to the business community as well for helping us do that. But if I may, that was athletic for me. Let me turn it over very much to the great orator, Minister Jaitley.
Thank you very much, Adam, for your very gracious invitation to the Peterson Institute. Indeed, an institution of great repute and credibility, and one of our dreams is establishing think tanks in India, a process which is just about started in India, would be to have a large number of similar institutions, considering the size of the country. And also thank you very much for sparing Arvind Subramaniam for us, for what he's been doing. He's been of great value as far as the Ministry of Finance is concerned and Government of India is concerned. You've asked me to speak on the tax vision, a subject which has certainly been surrounded by a lot of questions in the Indian context. But then before I speak on this, just a brief comment on what else has been happening in India. We are now in April 2015. And if a year ago, in March or April 2014, or slightly before that, anyone from India would have come here and spoken in terms of a large number of factors. Well, from a double-digit inflation, we'll be able to be down to less than 5% inflation. We are looking at 2 years from now, our fiscal deficit to be below 3%. Our current account deficit this year may be below 1%. Our growth rate from a disappointing figure, suddenly we move up 7.5% last year, targeting about 8% this year. And this has given us the confidence to aspire in terms of a double-digit growth. Now, exactly a year ago, this would have appeared to be a lot of an empty boast, something not reasonably possible. And with the decisive change that took place in India, I think one important aspect of that decisiveness was that after 30 years, we had a government which had a majority on its own in the lower house of parliament. Now, most of the economic decisions in India are either executive decisions or decisions in terms of financial legislation, which is only required to be approved by the lower house. So a lot of financial business in India is only constitutionally required to be approved only by the lower house. It's only when non-financial business requires a legislative change that you require the approval of both houses of parliament. And that is where we run into several challenges, because in the upper house we don't have a clear mandate as yet. Hopefully a year from now the situation would be somewhat improved, if not entirely improved. And notwithstanding that, in the last 11 months, you have had both legislatively and through executive mandate a very large number of decisions which have been taken which have an impact on India's economic situation. Petroleum products have been deregulated. What is not still deregulated, those subsidies are already being transferred through a direct cash system. Now, on the 1st of April, we started to everybody giving the subsidies on cooking gas through a cash transfer. And you have 140 million homes in India already receiving it in the last 4 months through a direct transfer into their bank accounts. You've had the largest financial inclusion program in the world. In fact, we were surprised when the Guinness Book decided to enter it in their records. Though that's only a small satisfaction. You had almost 130 to 140 million bank accounts of those families which had never an access to a banking instrument being opened in a 4-month period. And here I must compliment the banking staff who, through various agencies and instruments which we have created, went from home to home. In one of the world's most populated democracies, almost 100% of homes were visited. The only ones which were left out, which were not accessible or which were in the ultra left-wing influence areas where it was not, from a security point of view, safe to visit those homes. So over 99% of the homes visited said, yes, let's have a bank account. And now you have the second stage of all state support money going into this bank account. So now you have the actual process of monies getting into these bank accounts. All these poor people now have a debit card of their own. Their supports are going there, and now we are working on one of the largest social security schemes, which in the first instance is now going to cover, in addition to their right to get subsidized food, an accident insurance, a life insurance, in some cases a pension scheme. And currently we are working on a healthcare system to support this weaker section, and we are looking at almost 40% of India's population which would get covered by this process. A few days from now, one of the more difficult taxation reforms in India, which I'll later speak about, the goods and services tax, seems plausible. In the next couple of days, Parliament will perhaps approve the amendment to the Indian Constitution for it. It took us 10 years and we were wavering in the decision-making process. Despite opposition from some quarters, we've been able to raise caps as far as insurance is concerned. Defense did not require a legislative amendment. Railways did not require a legislative amendment. Real estate and smart cities did not require a legislative amendment. They've all been approved by an executive fiat. And I think it's the unleashing of the potential that we have in mines, mineral and coal. Coal with its particular impact on electricity generation in India. And from a regime where there were a large number of controversies, we've all been able to do it smoothly without a single allegation or a charge of any form being raised. Of course, land is required for development and growth. And that's going to be one of our main challenges in the next few years. How do we rationalize a very difficult law which the earlier government had enacted, which makes land for even rural infrastructure or industry or affordable housing for weaker sections almost impossible. There's a lot of investment which we've put in from budget support into infrastructure. And these are some of the key areas in terms of change that we've moved into. Now, when we come and look at the taxation vision, Our government had clearly stated, and I've repeated it several times, that we are not a high tax government. And therefore, our taxation policy is going to be guided by that principle. Secondly, what was a highly adversarial regime, we intend rationalizing it and making the tax department a lot more friendly to the assessee itself. Now, what are the various steps which we are going to take in order to rationalize India's taxation structures? I think the first big reform that we've planned, and probably in independent India since 1947, this will be the single most important taxation change, that we are going to switch over to what's called the goods and services tax. Now, if you want to manufacture a product in India, now the raw material that you import from outside, there'll be customs duty on it. That part of the taxation will still remain. That's not covered by the GST. But then when you start manufacturing it, you have a manufacturing tax called the excise duty. You have the input tax on various items which are used in that commodity itself. Now, when you move from one state to another, every state has its own value-added taxes. So, at the entry point of every state, you will have transportation vehicles piled up in hundreds waiting to clear their taxes and walk in. If you enter a city, you are liable for taxes within the city. It's called an entry tax or an octroi. Finally, when the consumer buys the product, you have to pay a certain amount of sales tax. Now, this inherently stops India from becoming one universal market. This also involves multiple taxation. Multiple taxation means several points of evasion. Additionally, it makes the goods costlier because there is an inbuilt tax on a tax. Even though some may be vatable at a subsequent stage. Now, the proposal currently is, by amendment to the Constitution of India, which is a very difficult thing. The Constitution of India can only be amended if both houses of Parliament by a 2/3 majority approve that procedure, and then 50% of the state legislatures accept it. And therefore, you need to build up a larger national consensus in order to amend that law, that all states agree, the central government agrees, that all these taxes, barring the customs duty, stand abolished. Instead of these taxes, there is one tax which is charged at the end point, at the destination. And this destination tax, through an IT backbone which is created, is then transmitted between the center, the state, and even the third layer of government, which is the municipalities, the local bodies itself. Now, this will involve, first a consensus being built up, which had eluded us. In the last 10 months, I have almost brought a near consensus. Almost every region of the country is in agreement with this. I have had to assure the states that if any one of them loses any revenue, for the first 5 years, Central will supplement that loss of revenue. In order to make this deal possible, one product permanently and one transiently has been kept out of the GST, because bringing them in at this stage would have been a deal breaker. That is, petroleum is out of it transiently. That is, it's for the present out of it. It is zero rated at the moment. But if the GST Council agrees, at a later stage it can be brought in. So the Constitution amendment would cover it. But the rating in terms of taxation currently would be zero till the GST Council decides otherwise. But the states were insistent on keeping alcohol out of it, because that's one major source of their revenue. So that's a compromise I've had to make. Now, after passing the Constitution Amendment in the current session of Parliament, which begins on the 20th, so hopefully by mid-May, the amendment would be through. 3 supporting pieces of legislation would have to be brought in the course of the year. The IT backbone is being prepared, and our target date is that on the 1st of April 2016, we put this tax into play. Now, this will bring a seamless transfer of goods and services across the country. The whole of India becomes one market. There is evasion which is plugged at all stages. There is no harassment of either industry or trade, that at every stage you have to pay taxes and then start claiming a refund in a subsequent stage of payment. And therefore, the goods and services would be taxed only at one last stage. Currently, service tax is only charged by the center, but now it would also be shared with the states itself. Now, observers believe that consuming states are going to gain largely. The manufacturing states initially may face a challenging situation, but then our past experience has been that broadly from day one they also stand to gain, because the width of the tax base itself increases. This also has a potential, according to many independent economists and tax observers, to push up India's GDP by 1 to 2% itself, this reform. So conceptually, this will be one of the most landmark taxation changes that we've made since independence. Because of the nature of federal polity in India, it requires the consent and the approval of all states, which we are doing so. On direct taxes, we've been working on a somewhat separate roadmap. And I think the most important change on direct taxes that we've brought is what I have announced in the budget this year. It will probably take some time for India's political system to absorb the impact of that change. In fact, this year when I was reading my budget speech, this was the only one question on which there was some adversarial noise as to why you are doing it. When I announced a 4-year roadmap for reducing corporate tax, or corporation tax as it is called in this part of the world, from 30% to 25%. So each year by 1 to 2%, I intend reducing it in phases and phasing out the exemptions. The rationale for this is that along with 30%, there is some surcharge. India therefore has the image of a country which, compared to its neighborhood and competing economies, has a much higher rate of taxation. The ASEAN region has about 21 to 22% corporation tax. And therefore, any investor would prefer to go and invest in those countries because he straightaway optically gets an advantage by investing in those countries. But we have so many complications of various forms of regional and product-based exemptions. It almost becomes like rent-seeking, that governments are pressured into giving exemptions, that I have a dual disadvantage. I have an image of a government which charges a high taxation, 30% plus surcharge, but my effective realization is 23% because of the exemptions. So a straightforward change which is being brought out, that I gradually phase out most of the exemptions and bring the rate of taxation down to 25%. So 4 years down the road, with 1 to 2% reduction each year, India's corporation tax would be 25%, which is fairly compatible as far as the region is concerned. There are several other changes in direct taxation which we are making. Wealth was subject to tax in addition to income, and particularly wealth lying idle was subject to tax. Now, this was a tax which led to evasion, which led to misdeclarations, which led to various bureaucratic complications. And the total realization in terms of Indian rupee was only 900 crores. Less than 1,000 crores used to be collected. So I have simplified the procedure. Since it's only the wealthy who had to pay this tax, I have abolished this completely, scrapped the entire parallel department which was working on this tax, which had which had a high cost and almost no yield as far as the state was concerned, and substituted it by just a surcharge on the super rich. Super rich is a very small number of taxpayers in India, probably about 40,000 people, who will have to pay a 2% additional surcharge. And by that surcharge, I more than make up this loss without any complication whatsoever in the taxation process itself. There's always a question raised about India's tax structure as to whether too few people are paying taxes. That's true. As far as direct tax is concerned, the number of assessees is very small. We have about almost about 37 million people paying those taxes as far as direct tax is concerned. But then indirect tax is to be paid by everyone. And therefore, Indian incomes being not so large, it's theoretically easy to speak about expanding the base, but then you would be targeting those sections of the people in whose pockets that we need to put in more money so that their spending capacity and saving capacity goes up. India's saving rate, which had touched 36% at one stage, was down to about 29%. And therefore, we need to incentivize saving. So on direct taxes, in a country which is a pension-less society, we are trying to create several changes. So the indirect taxes to individual assessees, unlike corporation tax where I am phasing out the exemptions, the object of the exemptions, and I have expanded those exemptions, is to ensure that there is an incentive on savings. And these are savings which you can utilize later on in life. Secondly, there is incentive also on savings in various pension instruments, which was earlier almost unknown in India. So this year I have taken a big leap and said everybody who invests in the national pension scheme gets a big exemption itself, which is capable of providing them a social security later in life. And therefore, I've been using the power of exemptions in direct taxes for middle class and individual assessees in compelling them to save and save through various instruments which are going to provide them social security much later. For instance, one of the, to bring about a change in Indian society from a social order. The girl child had been, in some parts of the country, been discriminated against. So for the growth, development and the education and the well-being of the girl child, we are one of the few societies which has now brought out a taxation saving instrument. In fact, the highest interest rate coupled with a tax saving is available for any parent who starts investing any amount in favor of the girl child. So these are powers of taxation being used to encourage a change in the social thought process in India. So if you invest in the name of your daughter, as she is born or at any stage in life, the highest small saving interest rate, it's a very high rate we give, about 9.3%. It's only available for a girl child. In addition to that 9.3, for every money that you invest in, you also get a deduction as far as your tax is concerned. So a lot of people are coming now in investing in favor of the girl child, and this is in areas where the girl child was discriminated against, being used to bring about a very important change. Now, having said all these good things, I come back to a more difficult area. And that difficult area is tax administration in India, which in the eyes of the larger world was seen as an unfriendly department. So how do we change the image of that department? And I think it climaxed with an important defining moment against India when we decided in 2011 to impose a taxation with retrospective effect. Now, a taxation with retrospective effect, at this time when it was imposed, I was one of the few people in Parliament who, then in the opposition, very strongly opposed it. And our party had strongly committed ourselves against that whole process. So if I look at my table, the problem areas are not these new initiatives which we are taking in terms of GST or corporation tax or exemptions with a purpose. My problems really are the legacy issues which I have inherited. I therefore announced when the day we took over that our policy would be that the present government would not use the instrument of a retrospective taxation at all, because it unsettles your tax planning. Two, even under laws which were legislated earlier, unless a particular procedure is found, ordinarily no new notice of any tax to be levied retrospectively would be issued to anyone. We've stuck to our promise. So there is absolutely no legislation which is retrospective. And even under the old laws enacted by the earlier government, there is not a single notice which has been issued. What I have on the table today is actions taken before the government took over during the last government's regime. The number is not too many, but the cases are symbolic. And therefore, our effort has to be to make sure that these issues get sorted out by a judicial process. Now, some of those cases have been sorted out with those tax demands being quashed. I had repeatedly said that the policy of the present government is that taxes which are payable should be paid, and we'll go to any extent to recover them. But then taxes which are not payable, those unfair demands can't be sustained, and therefore we are not going to make an issue out of those unfair demands. And some of these contentious cases, in all honesty, have not given me a single rupee of revenue so far. They've only brought a bad name to me. And this is essentially because of old legacy issues. Now, a number of these cases have been sorted out by courts, and those demands have been quashed. So after the demands were quashed by the courts, rather than agitate them further in appeal, I took the whole issue to the cabinet, and we decided that even though there was a potential for filing an appeal in the issue of larger tax stability in India and to get a better image to the tax department, we accepted the court's judgment and put a quietus to all those issues. There are, however, two categories of cases which are still pending. Some under the investment treaties are pending in arbitrations, and some where notices have been issued earlier, but assessments are being completed now. Now, those are cases which fall in one category itself. We are waiting for any judicial process to pronounce on them, so that the last of those surviving legacy issues itself could be settled one way or the other. There has been a recent, there's just been one recent case in relation to some foreign institutional investors, an application of minimum alternate taxation to them. They had represented to the government that it was an unfair tax. So for the future, I have abolished it. So with effect from 1st of April 2015, it's not payable. But having gone to a judicial tribunal, the FII has lost the case. Now, their expectation that having lost the case, the state must now intervene. That looks a little difficult from my point of view. And therefore, they have the option of agitating their remedies in law. It may not be possible for any government after a court verdict, which is a transient court verdict, which is still subject to appeals, to intervene in those particular matters. I think one of the very interesting sets of taxation laws for which we are giving notice today itself for parliamentary passage relates in two different areas, relates to the unaccounted money which operates in India. So far, governments have taken half-hearted steps, have not been able to achieve too much. This time I've taken a little sterner action, which has also invited adverse comment from those who probably may be at the receiving end of these particular legislations. With regard to the parallel economy which operates within the Indian system, and I can tell you there's a lot of it which operates. It operates in the property market, it operates in the jewelry market, it operates in the luxury goods markets. We are prohibiting in the property market the use of any cash. It can only be through a banking system that even advances for properties can be paid. With regard to cash transactions, following the internationally compatible model, if anybody spends more than 1 lakh rupees, which is the broad equivalent of something little less than $2,000 in India in the US in cash, your PAN number, which is equivalent to your social security number here, would have to be given. And therefore, this is going to create problems for a large number of people. But if we are able to start implementing it, and I hope in the next 3 weeks in the Parliament session to pass this legislation, making use of cash transactions extremely difficult in India. There have been a large number of cases in the disclosures which were made by the HSBC in Switzerland of a number of Indian entities owning undisclosed assets and income internationally. Now, in the new regime which is building up as a part of the G20 initiative and as a part of the United States law in this area, India is taking an active part in being a party to it so that there is an automatic transfer of any information. This is creating a little bit of panic amongst those who had unlawfully kept assets or resources outside the country. So I have now introduced in Parliament a legislation which deals with undisclosed foreign assets and income. It's a law for taxation on that income, where a compliance window would be open for a certain period. You would be liable to make a disclosure of that asset or income, pay your taxes, pay the penalties, bring the asset or income back to the country within the compliance window. And if you fail to do that, or in future, if you did keep it after the compliance window closes, there's a very stiff prosecution with a jail sentence up to 10 years. That's what the law provides. Both these pieces of legislations, I intend in the course of the next 3 weeks to get a parliamentary assent to these laws itself. Now, if I look at the big picture from where I started, between getting this money in the parallel economy back into the system, between implementing GST, these are all capable of adding to India's GDP. We are already touching 8% without that. Coupled with the extra investment which we are making into our infrastructure, one big neglected area has been our irrigation. And any future resource that I have in my hand in the years to come, we are in principle in agreement in investing a lot into irrigation, because agriculture is one area which can actually push up real incomes of a large number of people and add to our GDP. And the net impact of whatever reforms we have done in the the last 11 months or so, I think if this is looked at collectively, its potential impact on Indian economy is going to be far more positive. And therefore, if you are already 8% without all this, I think this is comfortably a roadmap to a double-digit growth as far as India is concerned. That's all I had to say in somewhat a longish comment. I'm sure there would be.
It's not so much, please join me. It's not so much a longish comment, Mr. Minister, as a masterwork. You've got so many levels from, as you put it, the investment in the girl child up to direct distribution of benefits, which is something we've been talking about on this stage. Nadam Nilekani was here talking about that. Arvind is talking about that you're actually making it happen, the changes in the energy subsidies, the obviously extremely important rethinking on the retrospective taxation. I mean, you have, if you'll forgive the German, a Gesamtkonzept. And it's wonderful to hear because I just compare that to the US where our eponym, Pete Peterson, and so many other friends of ours have been pushing for years for really thoughtful, radical reform of the US tax code, and we never get anything like that. And what you're talking about potentially passing the parliament in the next session is something that would be potentially transformative. So thank you for going through it with us in such length and such detail. Before I open it up to questions, I just wanted to pursue one particular issue, which is, you mentioned in passing some of these cases having to do with investment. There's obviously been some issues at the state level, I think of Uttar Pradesh on IT rules, who owns intellectual property. When you think about India for, as you obviously are doing, as our colleague Arvind is trying to help you do, for the medium to long term, it's one thing to talk about the getting the corporate tax rate down to comparable to your competitors and base broadening, getting rid of exemptions. That's wonderful. What do you think is necessary if you want to talk about some of the things that our colleague from USIBC spoke about made in India, about utilizing Indian IT talent, about getting India integrated in global supply chains? Is this something that the tax code should be dealing with? Is this something that other parts of your government should be dealing with? How do you see that sort of developing the high end, let's say, of Indian business going forward in a global sense?
See, if I look at it, the various steps which are required, I think the easiest of the lot is to take a decision to open out. So if you have, if you open your door, that's policy. So one decision and you open your door, I think that's an easier decision that has been done. Mm-hmm. I referred to taxation in the course of the discussion just now. I think for the future, it's possible to bring a very large number of positive change. It'll still take a few more months before some of the legacy issues get completely eliminated and put behind us. That's reasonably possible. What are the more difficult areas where I would still say it's work in progress? And I think the first would be what broadly gets referred to the ease of doing business. Mm-hmm. And in the ease of doing business, the time taken between the investor's decision to set up business in India and the actual start of his business. It is here that we require, at the level of the central government and the states, to pull up our socks. And therefore, it is this gap that we have to eliminate. Opening the door is inviting the investor, which is very easy. Laying down a red carpet for him is very easy. But then he can't indefinitely walk on the red carpet, because then he must actually start his process of manufacture. And therefore, we have to ensure that he doesn't have to run from office to office. All clearances that are required are given as soon as possible. And at the end of the day, the infrastructure which we are in the process of improving is also conducive to his business. Now, it is this second part which I said, that his ability to start his manufacturing quickly, I think is the biggest challenge that we have. And if there is one area where everybody has to put his head together and reform, is that area. So in the budget this year, I've set up a group which is already working, and that group is seriously considering whether all prior permissions required for establishment of your business can be substituted by a regulatory mechanism. Now, it could be crystal gazing because it's a very difficult challenge, but the group is actually working that what are the prior permissions which could actually be eliminated and be just substituted by a regulatory mechanism with guidelines which are laid down. I'm hoping to have some headway as far as this area is concerned.
No, that's fantastic. One more quick question, if I could. En passant, you mentioned the enormous strides. I'm not big on the Guinness Book of World Records, but the enormous, undeniable strides that India has made in terms of financial inclusion in recent years. And that obviously some of the things you're doing with the tax code in terms of the direct distribution of debit cards and benefits and that plays to that. And so I was just wondering what kind of role, how much further do you think that has to go in terms of where are the gains and the next fruit in terms of financial inclusion? And how much that is going to be an Indian government project versus an Indian private sector project versus having some foreign international players involved in creating the inclusion. How do you see that?
You see, the private sectors or the foreign banks also, their participation in financial inclusion has been very modest. It's the state sector banks which did a commendable job. In fact, the entire participation of the private sector banking, including international banks, out of this 140 million was only 2.3 million.
Really that low? Wow.
So it was minuscule. Therefore, it is, since it was a not-for-profit area, I didn't see a great enthusiasm, and which is something for them to ponder over. The accounts have opened. About 30% of the accounts have some element of money which they've invested their own savings into it. Now, in the balance, scholarships, poor people's pension, aged people's pension, widows' pensions, these are the state supports which we have, the state governments and the central government. So all these are now being put into those accounts. The cooking gas subsidies are being put into that account. And more state subsidies and supports which are being rationalized are now going into that account. So today we are passing through those slogovers where monies are actually being put into their accounts to make them functional. The third stage is when these social security programs are going to get linked to these accounts itself. But at the end of the day, these accounts can survive on basis of state support and these social security programs. But for these people, we want to look, they have to get work. They can't just survive only on the doles. And therefore, the strength of India's economy, if it grows close to 8% to a double-digit growth, I think the avenues for finding work for them. And I personally have always believed that this is where this amendment to the land law which we are bringing about is very significant. Other changes to the laws apart, there is a provision in the land law for a more liberalized availability of land, that for industrial corridors which run through rural areas, availability of land will be made easier. The whole procedure is a little easier. And therefore, rather than just have a cluster of industries in one part and nothing for the next 100 miles, I think it's these running corridors through rural areas which are able to invite jobs for people living in the adjacent villages. And the number of people in India who are landless is 300 million. And therefore, it is those who are the bulk of these account holders. So at the end of the day, you have to find jobs for them, and jobs for them will have to come from industries. Industries will have to be set by private sector. And therefore, one of the big challenges which we are facing in the land acquisition law is requiring land for these industrial clusters. And therefore, it's for those opposing that amendment to realize that it is these 300 million that they are actually opposing.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Let me open it up now to our distinguished audience. This is on the record, thanks to the minister being very gracious. As usual, Jessica's up front with a traveling mic. Those of you in back, if you want to go to the standing mic, please go ahead. That's the quickest way. Get up and go to the standing mic if you're physically capable of doing so. Thank you. Please.
I was incredibly impressed.
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
Yes. Emil Sunley, formerly of the International Monetary Fund. I was incredibly impressed with your outline of the tax reform, which India has struggled with for so many years. But a very narrow question relating to the excisable goods. Traditionally, countries impose their general sales tax or value-added tax on all goods and services, but then save a few goods for separate excise taxes. And the primary ones are alcoholic beverages, tobacco products, and petroleum products. You said petroleum products may come into the GST delayed. Alcoholic beverages are outside, held back still for the states as under current regime. What about tobacco products? Is there going to be an attempt to rationalize the treatment of tobacco products, possibly making them subject to the GST plus an excise tax?
No. You see, all taxes will be subsumed in the GST. And there was a demand by several states to keep tobacco outside, but we've not kept it outside. Alcohol is the only product that is kept outside completely. As far as petroleum is concerned, at the moment it is within the ambit of the constitutional amendment, but not being taxed for the present. It will be taxed only when the states collectively decide that it will be taxed.
Tobacco products would therefore be subject to the general GST rate?
The GST rate. The amount of rate will depend from product to product.
Wow. Please.
Morning, sir. Anit Mukherjee from the Center for Global Development. When I was working at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy doing a lot of these GST calculations, we had a joke that you need to be less a finance minister and more a foreign minister to get consensus. So it's congratulate you on that, and would like to hear your views on how you managed to forge the consensus. My question is, how would you see GST in the light of the 14th Finance Commission Awards, which you have talked about yesterday to foster competitive and cooperative federalism? How do you see GST fitting into that wider fiscal architecture going forward? Thank you.
You see, 14th Finance Commission was a test for any government's commitment to federalism. I believe that there is a very important change which has taken place in India. In our 68 years since independence, the initial 2.5, 3 decades, there were issues of democracy surviving, issues of India's integrity, sovereignty. And I think once we've settled all those issues, the last 3 decades, you've seen this increased emphasis on regional aspirations. It's not merely the emergence of the regional parties. It's not merely the participation of regional parties in central governance. But everybody has a kind of a commitment. And that's a reflective of India's federalism. Now, one difference between the present government and the earlier ones, that we've understood this whole desire of the states and the regions much more than the earlier government. And therefore, when the 14th Finance Commission said the states must get 10% more, that's actually a big challenge for me as a finance minister, because I have to balance the country's budget with 10% less money in my pocket. It was extremely difficult, but we did it. We not only did that, in order to help the states which were more deserving states because they had lesser resources, the most mineral-rich states in India were the poorest states. Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Odisha, West Bengal. The second most important decision we took was that all the resources we are getting by auctioning coal and mineral, rather than the central government keep it, we'll give it to the states which actually, where those minerals are geographically located. Now, the 14th Finance Commission and this decision to transfer the mineral money to the states has done one good. Now, most states have presented their budgets. And that's going to have a great impact on India's economy, either by the center or the states. No new or additional taxes have been imposed. So, by and large, the states have remained conservative in terms of taxation. No new taxes have been imposed. And therefore, product manufacturing, etc., is going to be a lot more competitive. There were old dues to the states, which we are now clearing up, which the earlier government had committed. Now, being convinced of our commitment to federalism, then we had to accommodate the interest of the states. For instance, if I had stuck on alcohol in GST, then it would be a deal breaker. So I did decide to compromise on that. We found a halfway solution as far as petroleum products are concerned. The states decided to agree on some other factors. We gave them a comfort level that if they lose any money for the first 5 years, we'll compensate them. And this has now had the effect of most states coming on board. So the language being spoken by most of them is a very positive language.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Fred Bergsten.
Mr. Minister, you're here obviously for a series of international meetings, IMF, World Bank, G20. I'd like to turn to some of the issues in that context with one general question, one specific question. The press has made a lot out of the fact that the growth rates you're projecting for India now are in excess of China, and that India may be growing faster, in that sense, the most dynamic of the emerging markets. How much does that competition with China motivate you in determining your economic policy, your growth strategy, the reforms you're putting in place?
You're allowed to say not at all.
You see,
But I want to ask a specific question too, because you may say not at all. I want to ask a specific question. Also, a lot of discussion recently about this new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that the Chinese have initiated, but which I think India is the second largest shareholder. I'd like to ask your perspective on that new institution and how you see it in comparison with the new bank that the BRICS as a group have put in place, which I believe is agreed to have an Indian as its first president. Yeah. So how do you see the relation between the new institutions, India's role, which is obviously very big in this context?
Thank you, Fred.
as far as China is concerned, we should always be conscious of the fact that China managed an average 9% plus growth rate for 3 decades. And that's where China reached where it was. I only wish what we started in 1991 had been dated back another 20 years. Probably we'd have been speaking of a different India today. We started late. And having started late, we had another important challenge. One of our biggest assets, India's parliamentary democracy, also required a decision-making process in several areas where you had to carry a large number of people along with you. And therefore, China never had that problem. They could take a decision and implement that decision. And therefore, our decision-making was relatively slower. Post 1991, we've never had a majority government till the present government came. And therefore, we've now realized that we have a potential of this 8-9% plus growth rate in India, and we'll have to continue it for a reasonable number of years. So the fact that in a given year we are numerically more than them in a growth rate is all right, but I think there's a lot of distance we have to cover, and therefore I'll always remain conscious of that. At times, even when we are recovering, our growths have been patchy. So you grow in one month, the next month's figures are a lot more challenging. So I still think, coupled with this large number of decisions we are taking, plus the other factors that I mentioned in the opening comment, these are areas where we have a lot of distance to cover. But there is a newfound confidence in India. And therefore, the whole object that we can grow faster, that seems to be a sentiment of policymakers. Both the institutions are going to supplement whatever are the global efforts on, whether it's the Asian Bank or the National or the BRICS Bank, as we call it. The institutions are in their evolving stages as yet. But because of the global uncertainties, funding for development, funding where contingencies are rising. Now, these are all the areas in which the potential of these banks will have to be realized. I don't see them in conflict with existing institutions. I see them as a supplement as far as the institutions are concerned.
Very good. Thank you for that, Fred. Gentleman at the back.
I'm Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute and the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for your fine overview, Mr. Jaitley. I have a quick two-part question. The first relates to retroactive tax. And I think your point that the retroactive tax was very damaging to India and that your government has been very clear that it takes a fundamentally different view of this is well taken. However, what would you say to an investor who says, I can trust you, Mr. Jaitley, I can trust this government, but as long as that law remains on the books, how can I be sure that in 7 years or 8 years or in 10 years or 12, it is not misused by another government that doesn't share your intention? So that's the first part. The second is about privatization. And I asked you because, of course, you're one of the pioneers of privatizing loss-making Indian public sector units going back to the first NDA government. And when one compares these two governments, at least so far, one finds that in terms of actual privatization, taking a loss-making state-owned firm, selling its shares, handing it over to private investors who could perhaps do a better job, this government has arguably been slower than NDA 1. So if you could just take a quick stab at these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
You see, as far as retrospective taxation is concerned, I think India's experience of the 2011 law has been very adverse. And therefore, if any government did indulge in that misadventure ever in future, the cost involved will be too heavy. Now, let's say even if I say I can't override parliamentary sovereignty, I can't bring a law which says that Indian Parliament loses its right to ever enact a law retrospectively. Even I did that, it will be illegal. Every legislature has that power. So any future parliament or a future government would have that power. But we've been doing a little bit in restating and re-emphasizing that it was not a sensible decision to do so. And therefore, I think the dangers of that retrospective legislation and the context in which it was brought has been driven home. Barring that one case which is pending under that law or another case which has now arisen, I think most of the other issues we've already put them to rest as far as retrospective legislation is concerned. You asked me on disinvestment. If you saw my budget speech this year, I used the word strategic disinvestment. And that almost indicates in the direction in which you've asked the question. But there is a difference between the last NDA government and the present one. And the present government is not tom-tomming disinvestment as the only course of possible economic reform possible. But numerically, I am collecting much more than any government in the past has done. For instance, even in the year just concluded, my disinvestment target is the largest ever divestment in Indian history. And this year is going to be much more, if not twice as much as the last year. And therefore, certainly strategic disinvestment in some cases is a part of my agenda. Which are the companies I choose for it, we make this decision known at a later stage. But in terms of quantum of disinvestment / privatization, we are way ahead of any government in the past.
Very clear answer. Mukesh Aghi.
Mr. Minister, I'd like to bring you back to international. What is your position on TPP and bilateral investment treaty, which the process has started? What are your priorities on that, and are you putting in timelines to that?
You see, there's a considerable amount of debate in India. We've had a large number of investment treaties with countries internationally, and both kind of alternative views are being expressed. Now, the concept of an investment treaty, insofar as it gives a fillip to investment, I think is a welcome concept. We'd like to encourage it. The terms and conditions will always be a question of discussion. And currently, we've come out with some model drafts. Some of our international partners want to have some additional terms. We have certain doubts about them. And I think that's still work in progress.
Yeah. I was going to say, if the minister will allow us, the lady has been waiting patiently at the back. One more question, please.
One very quick question.
I'm sorry, could you identify yourself, please?
Sorry, I'm Sho Chandra with Bloomberg News. Mr. Minister, you've laid out a very bullish growth scenario for India. I want to know what your concerns are and what level of risk you think there is from the external environment, given that the Federal Reserve here in the US is poised to start raising rates this year, which has implications for trade flows, financial flows. And how does that pose any kind of a threat or a setback to your growth goals, if you will?
You see,
and a related question about the rupee, which actually has had a very short-term run-up recently, to the point we are hearing some exporters talk about the pinch from the currency. I know India doesn't intervene except to stabilize the rupee, but any relief plans in the works? Thank you.
You see, by and large, the strength of the Indian economy is also reflected in the fact that rupee has remained relatively most within the stable range. And we do believe that the rupee will find its real value or real strength in the international currency market. Even when several currencies did face a serious challenge recently, it's been relatively more stable, even in relationship to the dollar. With regard to most other currencies, it has strengthened in comparison. international factors obviously have an impact. Now, our entire effort is, considering the vast depth and size of the Indian market, our ability to absorb those shocks is far stronger. So, even in the past, when international trends have been far more volatile, our dependence on our own domestic markets has made us relatively more stable than ever. And I think I won't call it threats or risks. If we continue with our own internal ability to carry on with our own reform process is our strength. And as long as we continue that, I think our ability to absorb various international possible scenarios would be reasonably high.
Fantastic. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley, you've been a terrific visionary and articulation of your vision. As I said before, I don't want to belabor this, but when I compare what you feasibly are actually going to implement in terms of reconceiving your tax code and doing it in the long term to the kinds of things the U.S. has fiddled with through the years, it's just a stunning thing and very obviously hopeful for India and for the world. As Fred rightly said, we recognize you not just as a leader in India, but as a member of the G20, as someone who's going to be critical in the international discussions going forward this weekend. And so we're delighted to hear you talking about India, in a sense, dealing from a position of internal strength and optimism. And we hope that that will allow you to continue to contribute to a more constructive world for all of us together. And most of all, thank you for letting Arvind Subramanian convince you with his efforts of what a wonderful place the Peterson Institute is. And we'll look forward to having you back at any time you're willing to share your time with us. Thank you.
Thank you.